All right. This is Rick, the Fat Man Hilliard, coming at you. And this is your seat at the table. Or maybe it's your place at the table. It's part of that memory issue I have, right? So, playing the court. This is a kind of an homage a little bit, because you see a lot of this in Game of Thrones. So if you played Game of Thrones, you probably have experienced this maybe to some degree. If you have read the books, you get a good idea of it. The Wheel of Time is another book series that comes to mind that has a lot of this intrigue and manipulation and maneuvering behind the scenes, so to speak, at the place of power. And I can think of a dozen other books, one after another, that basically fits in this same scenario. And there was a time, and there still is for some players and some groups, that this sort of thing is something we kind of encouraged or engaged in it from time to time as part of our experience. Now, in my opinion, and this is simply the fat man's opinion, that you really kind of have to have a experienced group of players who are all buying into this concept of what you're going to attempt to run or try to achieve. And some of them you can successfully do totally with just interaction at the table and negotiations and what have you. But, having a set of mechanics like Robert the narrator proposes would be quite useful for playing out this type of campaign. Now, it's something I've tried a few times over the years, and I've had varying levels of success. And I'll grant you, more often than not, failure as opposed to success, because once again, it takes a bit of a group of people with some knowledge, some experience at the table, and the willingness to buy into the concept. In my chosen way of doing things, there's a bit of resource management involved as well. And one of my goals was to have each player represent a certain element at court. So, i.e. the ministers, i.e. the advisors to the king. Nobody's the king. The king's an NPC. So, you're going to be advisors to the royal family. You're going to be employees of the royal family, however you want to look at it. And ideally, this is set up for epic level play. So you want to have character classes who are your characters need to be fairly established. So you're going to automatically either use older characters that you've had in the past and that you've leveled up through your regular adventuring, and then you've, quote, retired them, which is always a nice way to revitalize or revisit a favorite old character. Or start from scratch and figure anywhere from 7th to 12th level would be not unreasonable here. Ideally, the majority of these people are going to be in their middle age to their upper middle age, or not quite advanced in years. So I suppose you could have somebody who's in their 60s or 70s. I mean, that's the sort of role that these people would have eventually ended up in, and some with varying levels of success. You may have players or characters who are reluctant at being a part of this small council, if you will. And you may have characters who spent their entire lifetime gravitating towards this sort of field of battle. So you're not likely to have a lot of overt combat, i.e. drawing of weapons and firing fireballs off at each other in the middle of a courtroom, because that's kind of things frowned on in most royal courts. It's nothing else. It gets expensive and damaging the family heirlooms and generations of accumulated what have you, and or eliminating the competition in front of the boss and so on and so forth. Oh, this is up a bit high. You may or may not notice, but there's water on both sides of the road and a big RV parked there. I can relate to this because this was the route I drove a lot last year to get to the campground the wife and I spent quite a bit of time at. This road will occasionally close down. Thankfully, it's not closed. The detour is a pain in the backside. Anyway, my apologies for interjecting some of my real-world things into my ramblings. All right. I have a bit of a drive to go do a customer that my employer's wife scheduled me to do Thursday night by itself. Instead of, work all day Thursday and then have 4 or 5 hours off and then run back to the shop and run out 10 o'clock at night for a 2-hour job. Meanwhile, I have a scheduled job tonight that's about from 8 to 4 in the morning. Well, if I just run out here and take care of this other one first and be done by 6 in the morning, right? I'm already out all night anyway, so what's the difference? And the customers don't care. That's the thing, right? I'm not stepping on anybody's toes other than the would-be scheduling of the boss's wife who tries real hard. I acknowledge that. Okay. So I look at this as a opportunity to expand our game experience by playing in an arena that we're not often played in, that a lot of players can be not comfortable playing, which is one of the reasons they don't play in this sort of stuff. But if you can find the right group of players, you might find that there's a lot of interesting opportunities and experiences to be gained from this sort of thing, and there's layers and layers of fun to be had. Now, once again, ideally, these people need to be allies, but they need to be competing with each other too. So the fact of it is, they're going to have a handful of minions, if you will, assistants, bodyguards, the occasional spy, specialists, that sort of stuff, depending if it's appropriate for their particular position at court. And they're going to have a moderate amount of resources, financially speaking, often their own resources. This is something that's kind of tripped a few people in the past because, well, they just assume that all their expenses are covered by the crown. Well, that's not true. That surely is not true in the United States of America, which a lot of people have misconceptions about, including most of its population, that somehow or another, for example, the heads of state get everything a free ride, and that's not true. Even the president has to pay for a lot of stuff out of their own pockets if it's not considered in the interest of the state. So if you're having a dinner that's not a state dinner with a foreign dignitary involved, well, then you're going to pony up for it. So ironically or interestingly, in political maneuvering, and there's a reason why I'm going with this, because this all is parcel of playing at court. So if the president wants to throw a party or have a dinner party and he wants to invite a bunch of people that are not politicians or politicians but not dignitaries, adding the odd dignitary to the guest roll changes the thing. So if I have that third world nation's ambassador or head of the nation invite them to the White House, most of them are going to say yes. They're not going to turn it down. And now I can write it off as a business expense as part of the state, and the country pays for it, not the president. Imagine our current president probably gets away with a lot of that. Although I don't hear him having a whole lot of, state dinners and things like that. If they do, it's on the low because it just doesn't make the news, or not the news I pay attention to anyway. I guess it's not newsworthy enough. The same thing goes with ambassadors. Our former governor of Iowa, Terry Branstad, who is a 4-time governor. I don't personally like the guy, and I've met him. I actually shook his hand at the Iowa State Fair one year when I was a younger man, and I walked away with a little bit of disillusioned. Plus the fact that when I got there, I expected, here's this guy who's this governor of the state, most important political person in the state, sitting at this big fake desk in a fake booth, made up to look like, the governor's office, I suppose, with a couple state troopers standing next to him. And that's it. It was just him, the state troopers, my friend, and I. And I thought, we're in the middle of the day of the middle of the state fair, and there's 1 million people, 100,000, 200,000 people in the fair, and there is not a line to see this guy? Whoa, all right. I, even had a bit of a chat with him, but if I knew then what I know now, I'd had a much more educated chat with the guy. I think I was 20, 21, so what would I know? I thought I knew everything, but really, what did I know at 21? So these people are going to fund a lot of their own stuff, so they need to be fairly successful. So if they were adventurers in their prime, they were successful at it, and then they were picked, politically speaking, because of what they know or who they know, or it's a given that if you make these characters from scratch, that they're born into this career. Okay, so let's look at that for a second. That implies that they're going to have a different skill set, potentially, than what they would have if they were adventuring in the field, if they were out to go and slay the dragon, so to speak. Now, that said, there's no politician character class, right? Not in Dungeons and Dragons, and not in many sci-fantasy or fantasy game systems, although in science fiction game systems, sci-fantasy, I guess, there are some. We see one in the Aristocrat or something like that in the occasional game system, or the ambassador, which are all intent purposes a politician, a political class. So they have a different set of skills and or feats or advantages for their class. So if you're losing the Game of Thrones type, you're going to look at these different people. So if we look at the Jaime Lannister, who starts out as a King's Guard, one of the premier King's Guards, not just the rank and file, but the personal bodyguard thereof, and he's learned his skills as being a knight. He fights in battles. He eventually learns to lead military units in combat. He's quite successful at one-on-one combat. He understands protocol quite well. It's beat into him by his father, who expects a lot out of him and is always terribly disappointed, especially since he became one of the King's Guard and no longer can, ideally hold land or be married, etc., etc. Meanwhile, later in his life, he actually leads the defense and the armies for his sister on a number of occasions. He ceases to be, eventually makes Lord Commander of the King's Guard, or the Queen's Guard, I guess. King's Guard, while his illegitimate children were still in power. Eventually he becomes removed from that role, or removes himself from that role, and then becomes basically the head of the general of the army. So he has quite a lot of military experience. What you don't see that goes along with that, you very briefly, I'm going to correct myself, you very briefly see this with Jaime Lannister, because there's a couple scenes in the TV series, there's more in the books, but in the TV series you see him at the Tower of the Guard or what have you, and he's looking at the book, the white book of whatever, and this is where all the exploits and special occasions and merits and awards and what have you are recorded for the various members of the King's Guard. And so you're looking at the fact that they do learn resource management. They do learn to deal with the paperwork side of being a commanding officer in a military of any significant size. So his father, we see scenes of his father doing that sort of stuff too, briefly. It's just as an homage to remind you that this sort of thing is part and parcel of being that person. So the same thing goes for if we have a mage who could be the head wizard, the senior wizard who's in charge of the wizards, the Royal Wizards Coalition, or the Royal Wizards. I don't know. I cringe to use the term guard, and I know there's terms for it. I'm just scratching for them at the moment. So in this case, the guy has proved himself to be a wizard, and that takes, as anybody knows, anybody's going to be a magic user is going to spend their entire lifetime pursuing this, and it takes a lot of effort to get to be any significant power. Now, it doesn't mean to say that you need to be an arch wizard or master what have you to be the head of the wizard's position. Let's say the Sages Guild or the Sages Ministry for the king. But it helps. So, you might have a number of roles. Your particular role may be to keep track of keep an eye on all the wizards and magic user types in the realm, especially the ones that are not native to the realm. You might be in charge of gathering information, or one of the arms of gathering information for the king, depending on if the king's savvy enough. I think if we're using the Game of Thrones analogy as an example, Robert Baratheon was the most lousiest king you could have. He didn't care about any of the important stuff that he didn't want to be bothered by the pennies and the whispers. Only unless it was a direct threat to his idea of what he should be. At that point, he overreacted instead of being subtle. He was a very bad king. He was a poor king, and he knew it. There's the irony there. He knew he was a bad king, and part of him did care, and part of him had given up on it, being a good king. It was just he was all about the battle as a young man, and the women and the wealth and the power, and more important, the glory and the respect of his peers, especially on the battlefield, and not so much on after the fact. And he didn't get what he wanted at the end of the day. He had to settle in his mind. He settled for second best. The love he wanted was killed, and he ended up being saddled with a woman he really didn't like, whose father he did not respect, and it was a political marriage, and everything that could go wrong went wrong. And he did as little as possible to try to make it work. And that's how that worked. So we got a potential leader of the king's armies or the king's guard, and this person will have had a militant background, a martial background. He's experienced as an administrator to some degree, whether he's good at it or reluctant. That's up to the player and how it plays it out. The head of the wizards or the sage, the head of that particular section of the small council, would be quite a fairly accomplished wizard, possibly having more in the area of contacts and knowledge of his peers, so he can utilize their expertise, because that's something that gets touched on a lot more in Forgotten Realms novels than in other book series, is that your particular, your wizard in general is a specialist. They specialize in certain, and you know this. You pick you're going to be an evoker or divinationist, or you're going to be in the necromancy, a necromancer, what have you. There's a couple dozen different specialties, and while they have a lot of common spells, and you can utilize common spells no matter what their background, there's a lot of stuff that they're kind of tuned into that the others can't use. So they're limited in some ways and advanced in others. Having a wizard who can do a bit of everything as being in charge at least has the working knowledge of what his peers, his magic-based peers, are going to be able to do and expect, and how to monitor them. He surely isn't going to control them. I can think of a couple wizards from the Forgotten Realms novels that come to mind. In this case, Cormyr. It's Vandergast, I believe. Vandergast, who's the head of the battle wizards, for the battle wizards of Cormyr or what have you. And it's just, in addition to that, he's the chief advisor to the king, and he's the instructor, mentor to the king's offspring, etc., etc. So we look at having 3 to 4, maybe 5 players, each one filling a specific role. Now, together, they're supposed to safeguard the kingdom and to promote the king's wishes. Ideally, the GM has some leeway here. You can have a very, lackadaisical king, or he could have an aggressive, crazy king. And depending on how he chooses to play out that NPC role, the players are going to have to adapt to accommodate for it. I mean, if they start plotting to kill the king and replace the king, well then very well, you've already got yourself a game, and this is the way it's going to go. If their job is to mitigate the major excesses as best they can and to keep the kingdom from falling apart, for dealing with foreign ambassadors and foreign emissaries, and dealing with keeping the military strong and the economy strong, and the social, health and well-being of the kingdom strong. I mean, that's something you don't see in a lot of fantasy settings, because we tend to do a wink and nod at stuff like that. It was real easy to cure most of the ills of the world with magic. So when things like plague and disease and social misery crop up, well, enough magic users and clerics, and we can keep the worst of that in check. It is an occasional rare illness that breaks out that defies, maybe somebody's anger to God, and now we've got something that's resistant to healing magic and or cure diseases. Or we have an economy where there's not as many of those types around, and so the rank and file, the masses, do not have access to as the healing abilities like the wealthy do. Now, in Forgotten Realms, it's implied that majority of these temples, even the wicked, evil temples, do some charity work, that they do help to some degree with the masses. So they help mitigate this possibility. It's just like the argument where technology is superseded by magic. Well, in some game worlds or novel worlds, magic is technology. So it's, we don't have as much high technology because we have high magic. And in some places it's much more sophisticated and much more smoother and convenient to say, we'll just have the magic running this thing or taking care of it. So I look at this and I said, all right, so I got 3 to 5 players. Each one has a particular role. Each one's a character class. And they're going to be, reasonably high level. Like I said, 7 to 12 is not unreasonable. If you want a 20 level stuff, knock yourself out. Just got to be prepared for it. Now, keep in mind that most of these people are not going to be rushing out. They're not the troubleshooter squad. These are the people who send the adventurers. They send the specialists to go deal with the problem. They themselves don't generally deal with the problem unless it's on their doorstep, physically speaking. So, the head of the military is an administrator first, and a general second. If he does go out in the field, we can segue this a bit. This is where you have that ability to say, okay, you may be in the field leading an army against an opposing, to stop an invasion or to make sure that our invasion of a neighboring whatever is going well. And in the process, you're in constant contact with the small council because you have this magic ability to communicate, or we're using, small wervins or ravens or flying lizards or flying felines, whatever works for you. And that allows you to stay in contact with the others at the table and have negotiations and discussions with them, to engage in social combat with them directly over I need more money for the army. My army needs more men or needs more supplies, or we need to replace losses that we've taken, blah, blah, blah. Or the economy's, the little finger of the court, the man who's in charge of the treasury, is saying, look, we need more taxes. I don't want to, it's really not a good idea to raise taxes because the population's already overburdened. Maybe we need to do a levy against the outlying nobles and say, hey, pony up. Or did you hear about that? I heard a rumor of an adventuring group that stumbled across the dragon's hoard. I think it's fair that they give 30% to the crown. Don't you agree? Aye. So send somebody out to collect. Well, I don't want to. The army says, I don't think I need to send my guys. And the head sage says, well, that's kind of beneath me. So maybe the chief cleric says, I'll send some people to have a discussion with these folks. And so on and so forth. All right? This is the opportunity to have many different layers of stuff going on. And I've heard a couple other people in the past few months bring up the subject of, would you play in a situation like this? Would you play a game where you are basically the little council of a king, and it's all about diplomacy, maneuvering, and the other people? And I would gladly play in a game like this. How successful? I don't know. I mean, I have learned hard lessons about my own hubris, and it's still my ego gets the better of me on occasion, as it's been pointed out to me recently. I think that my ego may have gotten out of line, but at the same time, my intention was honest and truthful. In my bombastic, bumbling way, I was trying to get a consensus for how I wanted a certain thing to be viewed, and I didn't do a good job of it, and so I let it go. I just have a little less enthusiasm about something that I had a lot of enthusiasm about. But that might be because the shininess has worn off a little bit too. But that doesn't matter. Things settle down, and maybe it'll be a smoother read at the end of the day. This is where the rewrite and the editorial stuff will come into play if it progresses far enough. So when I looked at, how do we play a game in this environment, I thought, okay, obviously everybody has to have a certain amount of resources, and they're going to vary a little bit. Each individual section of the government, so to speak, is going to be in competition with each other. I mean, we see this in modern governments today, and the American government is always in competition with each other. They don't pretend like they're not, but it's mostly about budgets and control. You don't think the military doesn't try to dominate the politics at the White House? You are badly delusioned, because they have done that over and over and over again, because it's like I've heard before in certain government entities where they go, well, we're not a company, we're not here to make a profit. Bull hockey, the hell you say? That is such a pack of BS. I could package this and sell it as fertilizer, and probably some people do. The fact of the matter is, there is no government entity that's not into making a profit. The idea of making a profit isn't like a corporation. The idea of making a profit is holding on to their turf, expanding their turf, and getting a bigger piece of the government pie, the taxpayer pie. They want to make sure that theirs is taken care of, but they also want to expand. They want to hold their own. So, and the way the government budget system works, and I don't care if it's the state level or the federal level or the local level, that's often the way it works, is the politicking behind the scenes of who's, I need an extra 10,000 or I need an extra 10 million for this particular ministry or this particular department, so we can purchase extra equipment or hire specialists, or to improve our existing infrastructure or things that we already have, because if we don't keep up with the Joneses, blah, blah, blah. Or because, money is power and politics is power. And while you're not enriching yourself personally as the head of a ministry or head of a department, you are enriching your prestige and your social power, so to speak. Now, if you're going to talk about social combat, prestige is one of those key things. Now, how much prestige do you have? Have you lost prestige? I mean, Lee the other day did a video, and he was talking about this French film that's it's dubbed, and they were talking about this fellow who was basically shamed at court, and it cost him a lot of his prestige, and so he more or less disappeared from court for a long time, and then he came back, and the person who had shamed him was old and feeble, and he beat on, he pissed all over him, literally, not just figuratively, literally. He regained some of his personal prestige, but at what cost? So prestige is an important thing. So our characters need to keep that in mind. They need to keep in mind their station. They're not just how well they're liked by their ruler, i.e., the king don't have to love you to respect you. The king doesn't have to be your buddy to need you to do what you do because you're good at what you do. And he or she needs to know that you're good at what you do and be able to count on you or depend on you. And yet the king's a fool if they depend on you too much, if they put too much trust in your abilities and one person's power. This is seen in history over and over and over again. It's just very complex. Reminds me a little bit of a different version of diplomacy, like I said. I dug my diplomacy box out and I got the maps, I got a few things, and it just bugs me is the core book is missing. I don't remember taking it out of the box. I must have took it out for some reason. I don't see it in my other stuff, and I feel got some more boxes in the in the garage I have yet to unpack. But I'm going to have to. I want to do a video on diplomacy, the game, and so I've got I got a PDF of the rules. I just haven't had time to print them out and actually do the video. So I want to print the rules out, read over them a little bit. Then I'm going to do a video on it. But you can take diplomacy to this level. We're doing the little council, the small council of diplomacy. Now, a lot of players, they're going to get bored with this kind of game system. They're just going to get bored with it quick, or if they don't buy into it well, right? And as a GM, I'm not sure how to get players to buy in. I try to make it encourage, I try no matter what I do, I want them to enjoy themselves, but I want them to get on board with my vision of what I'd like to see things. And this is not an ego thing in my mind. It's not ego-based to say that. I'm thinking, I got an idea and I want everybody to be on the same page. And if one or two players are not on the same page, then, certain things just don't work out the way you'd like them to. And it's always compromise. I've always acknowledged this compromise. And that also is not an ego thing. Me talking about ego is also not an ego thing. You can't talk about something that I don't know what to do. Honestly, I don't. You can get the different kinds of players, and you can get some that just seems like they go out of their way to be the extreme. Whatever it is you kind of would like them to do, they've decided that they're going to go and, I'm going to surprise you, and I'm going to go in a completely different way. And it leaves you sitting back puzzled and scratching your chin thinking, what's up with that? You mean you'd rather your character retire or go off to be a hermit somewhere? I get confused. I mean, you wanted the character, you played the character quite successfully in a certain manner, and now you're trying to, I don't know what you're trying to achieve here, and by shutting all the avenues for play down, I'm left with scratching my head thinking, what's up? There's a type of player who likes to just change characters every now and then. They get bored with playing whatever they're playing and then decide, I want to do this. And then so they play that for a month or two, and then they're going to get bored with the next character. How many times is this going to work out? As the game master, that's frustrating. I think of 4 or 5 different, I try to be 4 or 5 moves ahead of my players a little bit. This has allowed me to have certain things prepared, and I'm always willing to discard one thing for something else that's successful. And a lot of times the players will take things in a different route, and sometimes the characters have a voice of their own, and they will step up, and they will go about doing something different. So doing this in the most complicated style of gameplay. So trying to do this social maneuvering, this social environment play is why I said that you need a very experienced group of players, and they absolutely must buy into this. Because there's too many dominoes in play. Once you start stacking up dominoes, and one of those players decides they want to kick the dominoes early, or they want to pull out a domino because they don't want to, they just, for whatever reason, are trying to, trying to surprise you somehow. And in doing so, potentially can break the game. You can break the game because there's only so many potential outcomes that can be envisioned by an individual. And if all those outcomes are completely stymied or checked, you've got a checkmate here. What do you do? How do you overcome this so that it doesn't screw up everybody else's fun? I struggle with that, and I've struggled with that often in my lifetime. That's probably a failure, a flaw on my part. What else do you do? I love this time of night because the mail guys are just pumping. Those trucks that are just hammering past me are FedEx and UPS and the U.S. Postal Service, and those boys are hauling well above the speed limit. Just saying. Don't get in front of those guys. What are you going to do? Yeah, what are you going to do? Keep from getting run over. So, I like the idea. I've tried to play it before with moderate levels of success. I actually found, ironically, some of the best types of this type of style of play, this play in the court, is with one or two players. You know, that solo game where you've got an experienced player who's enthusiastic, who isn't afraid to add a little fluff, who's not adverse to potentially playing a couple different character roles in a single campaign. So a friend of mine who played a house lord also played his chief assassin, and played a number of secondary characters who basically carried out the whims of the leaders and so on and so forth. And geez, we played that campaign for 3 years. Yeah, it was 3 years. And then we did a different one, and it lasted a year and a half. So I mean, it's like the long view. I mean, I'm a big fan of the long view of things. Not so many people want to play that anymore. You know, it's hard to get people to buy into that one. Well, here we coming in to the KFC Taco Bell combo, and they'll be closing soon. If they ain't, they're going to be terribly surprised because I'm going to shut them down and pump out their intercept. You know, get into here at their parking lot. Oh, you gotta love the potholes here too. All right. Okey-dokey. There you have it. What are you going to do? You're going to play the long view? You're going to play the big game? This is the fat man saying, give it some thought. How would you approach that kind of a setup?